define emotional labor, talk about the factors and impacts of emotional labor, talk about different strategies for assessing constructs in emotional labor, and then a little bit at the end about ways to potentially enhance emotional labor. So just a little bit about how I got interested in emotional labor and some of the work that I've done. Actually, I started my research career as a graduate student and as an assistant professor doing research on work motivation. So that's still a topic that is quite of interest to me, and I spend a lot of my research attention on that. But as a brand new assistant professor in a psychology department, one of my first students came to me and said, I want to do research on customer service for her dissertation. And I knew nothing about customer service. And I said, well, where is the psychology with customer service? She came back and said, oh, I think it's here in emotional labor. And so I want to thank my first PhD student, Robin Gassaran, for actually introducing me to the topic. And from there, Robin and I wrote a theoretical paper, which I'll talk about briefly in just a little while. We adapted a measure of emotion regulation strategies, which I'll also talk about in just a little while. And then we published some empirical work based on her dissertation. Since then, I've published around 25 papers on various topics under the heading of emotional labor, including emotion regulation strategies, which we'll talk about shortly, emotional display rules. I also edited a book on emotional labor about 10 years ago, and I'm currently editing a new handbook of emotion regulation at work that has 27 chapters from scholars from various disciplines throughout the world. So that'll be available in, I think, 2025 approximately. So I'm really excited about that project. Some of the attention on emotional labor that I've spent is where a lot of people think of, and that is customer service jobs, where you're supposed to show positive emotions. I've also spent time doing research on emotional labor with nurses and other healthcare workers. I'm currently doing 2 projects with different hospitals on trying to enhance the ways that healthcare workers manage their emotions on the job. And I've also spent a lot of time with call center workers. So having to manage emotions when you're not face-to-face, but when you're doing work over the phone. My research design methodology, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but early in my career, I spent a lot of time looking at in general and what we might call static assessments of emotional labor constructs. Increasingly, I've turned to the use of more event-based repeated measures assessments, so I can model what you might call emotional labor dynamics, how things change over time when you're managing your emotions. Currently, I have several empirical projects going on. One of the things I'm spending a lot of time on, though, across several projects, is understanding how you can develop automaticity in emotional labor, so being able to do it automatically and relatively effortlessly. So the definition of emotional labor, but actually I'm going to do a slight detour here so we define some more basic kind of constructs that inform emotional labor, is that first let's talk about what emotions are. And you can define emotions as short-lived responses to events that help us adapt to our environments. So something happens, you have a response that's both a feeling, it's a physiological change, it can be an expressive change on your face, and it can be a behavioral change that allows you to adapt to this emotional event. And so there's a natural kind of sequence or trajectory that emotions tend to follow. So you have a situation or event that occurs, you direct your attention to that aspects of the situation or event, you appraise what's happening, you give it meaning, you ascribe some sort of meaning to it, and then you have a response. A lot of times it's an emotional expression, can be a behavioral action that you take. And that's kind of the natural trajectory that most emotions kind of follow. So then you can ask, well, what is emotion regulation then? And basically, emotion regulation, the strategies that people use are basically attempts to try to alter that emotional trajectory. So you have this situation, attention, appraisal, response kind of sequence that you follow. Emotion regulation is trying to intervene at various points so as to impact the emotions that you might have. And so this could even occur prior to experiencing the event or the situation. So you can select different situations so as to alter the emotions that you might be experiencing. You can, once in the situation, try to modify it in some way, sort of change features of the situation so as to alter how it affects you. A lot of times on the job, and we'll come back to this in a little while, but a lot of times when you're working, you can't choose the situations, you can't modify the situations. So you have to then do things to alter your reaction to it. And that includes what you might call attentional deployment, which is focusing on different aspects of the situation. So maybe there's a part of it that's very emotional and there's another part of the situation that's less emotional. You can focus on that less emotional part. Or cognitive change. And this is when you reappraise what the meaning of the situation might be so as to alter how it makes you feel. And then finally, you can talk about once you've fully experienced an emotion, you can also intervene at the point of the response that you generate. So you can, if you are feeling angry, you can try to hide that anger or show that a smile so as to present something that's different than what you're actually feeling. So then you might also ask, well, then why do we regulate our emotions? So, what's the reasons that underlie this? And it sort of is maybe obvious, but emotions can be situationally inappropriate, which means that it doesn't match maybe what the emotional goal is for a particular moment. So you may need or want to feel or express a certain emotion, but you feel something that's different from that. So then you regulate, and emotional goals can generally be of at least a couple different varieties. So you can have a hedonic goal to simply feel good, for instance, or you can have an emotion or an instrumental goal, meaning that you might want to feel an emotion or show an emotion so as to accomplish something else. So you might know that feeling anger will help you do something, or feeling happy will help you do something. And so that might underlie kind of the reasons that you might engage in regulation to begin with. So to summarize, emotion regulation involves the presence of some sort of emotional goal, some sort of desired emotion that you want to feel or express. It includes some sort of felt emotion. And then oftentimes there's a discrepancy between that felt and desired emotion. Right? And that then stimulates the use of emotion regulation strategies to realign your feelings or expressions with the goal. And all of this kind of comes together in what you might call an emotion regulation system, where you have the emotional goal to feel or express something, and then you have your actual felt or expressed emotions that you perceive. That's the input part. So you perceive how you feel or how you're expressing yourself. And then that gets matched against what the emotional goal is in a comparator, right? And if the comparator doesn't see that there's a difference between them, there's no discrepancy between your goal and what you feel or what you're expressing, then you don't need to regulate. You just continue doing whatever it was you were doing emotionally. But if you see that there's a discrepancy between the feeling and the goal in that comparator, then you have to do something. You engage in an output function, which would typically be to regulate your emotions in some way. And you can see it's kind of a cyclical process. It operates all the time. You're always comparing how you feel or express against what the emotional goal is, looking for a discrepancy. And if there is a discrepancy, you regulate, you do something to alter the feeling or expression. You can also see that there's room here at the bottom that for unexpected events to occur that can change how you feel or what you're expressing, which can then create a discrepancy that maybe you need to address and respond to by regulating your emotions. So this is a dynamic, process-based kind of view about how we regulate our emotions. By the way, if there's any questions at any point, or if I'm talking too fast and you need to hear something again, just stop me and let me know. I'm happy to answer questions or repeat anything that you need.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
Great. So this is just some background on emotion regulation. So now we're finally going to talk a little bit about what emotional labor is. And emotional labor is basically the idea that emotional expressions have become a marketplace commodity, meaning that it's something that is now bought and sold by organizations. So it used to be that organizations basically would expect people to exert physical labor, and then they would pay them in return, or maybe cognitive or mental labor, and they would pay employees in return for that labor. But Hochschild in 1983 acknowledged that now organizations are beginning to actually expect people to take this very kind of private experience of felt emotions and to expect employees to manage those emotions in return for a wage. And so this notion of trying to make emotions a commodity that are bought and sold by organizations was a brand new idea in Hochschild's formulation, and really something that came about with the rise of what you might call the service sector, or service kind of aspect of society, where organizations exist primarily to provide services to people, right? And so now, as part of that, customers expect certain kind of emotional expressions, and now employees have to manage their emotions in order to do the job well. So emotional labor can be defined as emotion regulation as part of the work role. Again, this used to be just for private purposes. You'd regulate your emotions, and now you're doing it on behalf of what the organization wants. You can also define it as the act of expressing organizationally desired emotion. So organizations expect certain things, you have to show certain things as part of the job, and that can require you to regulate your emotions in accordance with the work role. It all kind of starts, this whole emotional labor process starts with the idea that organizations specify emotional display rules. So they expect you to have perhaps something like service with a smile, or to show a particular emotion as part of what the customer is going to receive. That, in effect, is what the emotional goal is in emotional labor research. So emotional labor then involves conforming to these display rules regardless of what you may be feeling. So sometimes you may feel what is needed and you can simply show that, but other times you may not be feeling what is needed. So you might need to use emotion regulation strategies to align your expressions with expectations. Backing up just a little bit, we can talk about kind of the nature of what these emotional display rules are. Wharton Erickson, 1993, outlined 3 main categories of emotional display rules that organizations expect. And these kind of correspond to different occupational types. So one type of display rule is to express what we might call integrative emotions. And this includes demands to show positive emotions and to not show negative emotions. And this is by far the most common type of display rule when you think about emotional labor in organizations. And it typically would be what you would see with customer service jobs, where you want to present a positive expression to customers. But you also see it in other occupations like healthcare, where there may be a desire to show positive kind of empathetic emotions to patients in order to help them feel better. There are also jobs where the expectation might be to show what you call differentiating emotions. This is actually the opposite of integrated emotions, because here you're showing negative emotions and hiding any kind of positive emotions so as to impact the people that you're working with in some way. So here in the pictures are examples of like a police interrogators who are asking a potential criminal, you know, their whereabouts and maybe what they were doing, that maybe they suspect a person of a crime. Or you have like a security guard And the idea is that they show negative emotions so as to get people to comply with what they want. There are also occupations that engage in what you might call emotional masking. And here you have a judge and also a psychotherapist. And so in both of these instances, the display rule is to show nothing, to not show positive, to not show negative. And the act of doing so makes the person seem impartial, non-judgmental, and sort of an authority on the matter, so that they're calm and composed. And so this then makes the people that they're interacting with feel that it's fair, that they're not being judged, and that there's kind of a lack of emotional experience in the person they're interacting with, sort of an authority figure, you might say. So again, most commonly you see that the integrative emotions are what are expected in organizations, and that's where I've focused a lot of my personal research attention, is on occupations where the integrative emotions are expected. So emotional labor then entails following these display rules regardless of how you feel. Sometimes, though, people can express what you might call naturally felt emotions, and this is just being in a situation where what you need to show naturally matches what you're feeling at the time, right? So you can be authentic and genuine in your emotional expressions. However, sometimes you may feel something that's different, and so you might need to use emotion regulation strategies. And in the emotional labor literature, Hochschild identified two different emotional labor strategies. One is what you might call deep acting, and this is when you attempt to change your felt emotions to match display rules so that you can genuinely express what is needed. So here, you're altering your internal feelings as a way to show something to others. In contrast, surface acting is a situation where you basically fake unfelt emotions and suppress what you naturally feel so as to display what is needed. So you don't change anything about what your internal experience is, and you focus only on the external appearance. So you might show a smile, hide your anger, but that emotion still exists within you. So putting this all together in the same kind of model that you might see with emotion regulation, this is me and my first student, Robin Gossaran, that I talked about earlier. This is the theoretical paper that we developed. You can apply the same kind of process model to emotional labor. The goal is the emotional display rule. You're then comparing how you are feeling or how you're showing or displaying your emotion to that emotional display rule in the comparator. If there's a match between them, then you don't have to do anything. You can simply show your naturally felt emotions. But if there's a discrepancy there, then you have to engage in some emotion regulation, which in the emotional labor literature, they would call this surface acting or deep acting, so as to align your emotional expressions with that emotional display rule. So again, it's a dynamic process model. It's always running, it's always operating. You're always comparing your feelings and expressions against display rules. And if there's a difference between them, you activate surface acting or deep acting to realign the expressions with what is needed. So thinking about how this then compares to the emotion regulation research that I described earlier, you might wonder, how do deep acting and surface acting align with those emotion regulation strategies in that basic kind of literature that I described earlier? Well, so thinking about that, the strategies I talked about earlier, deep acting is typically focused on trying to change the internal feelings, and the way you do that oftentimes is something like attentional deployment, try to focus on the positives in a situation, or cognitive change, which is when you rethink kind of the meaning of the situation. So if a customer is being very rude and difficult, you might think, well, actually, this is an opportunity to help this person feel better, right? or it's not me that they're mad at, it's the situation. So you kind of are able to reframe it so as to lessen the emotional impact of the situation on yourself. And that's kind of deep acting in accordance with the notion of cognitive change. Surface acting then aligns very closely to the response modulation idea, where you're only altering the kind of the outward appearance of emotion by either suppressing what you feel, not showing anything, or faking something else, simulating an emotion like a smile, so as to convey maybe you want to appear happy despite not being happy. So next topic then, factors and impacts of emotional labor. So in thinking about the work that's been done on emotional labor, the empirical work, the vast majority of it has focused on the regulation strategies. And so the topics of deep acting and surface acting have really become quite popular. Researchers are quite interested in understanding the differential impacts of these two strategies. Less research has considered the expression of naturally felt emotions, but there has been some attention on this, and I think that there's a connection to this notion of emotional labor automaticity that I'm currently doing work on. So I think that there's an opportunity there to kind of think about how those two topics relate. Generally, though, when thinking about how do deep acting and surface acting have their effects on outcomes, there are basically three primary mechanisms that are brought into the discussion. And the first one is just effort. So it's widely acknowledged that both deep acting and surface acting are pretty effortful. And so you might expect that this effort could make it harmful for individuals, right? If you're exerting a lot of effort, you can become depleted or exhausted, and that could lead to potential negative outcomes for employees. In contrast, the expression of naturally felt emotion should be relatively effortless. Now, you do have to still show an emotion as part of the job, and that can require some effort, but there isn't the need to really kind of regulate in any way. So what you need to show is just kind of what you're experiencing already, but maybe doing it in a slightly exaggerated kind of way. Another mechanism that's involved here that it can determine the outcomes of these emotion regulation strategies is the felt emotions that people are ultimately having. So with deep acting, if you think about what's happening here, if the expectation is to show positive emotion, and deep acting basically removes any negative emotion that you might be having and replaces it with a positive one. So that positive feeling that you're having should be good for you, should enhance your well-being, perhaps. In contrast with surface acting, you're not getting rid of any negative emotion that you might have. In fact, you're kind of holding it in and only suppressing it. And so with this, you're not getting the benefit of any positive feelings from the regulation, but rather you're pushing down your negative feelings without really removing them in any way. Felt emotions are already positive for the expression of naturally felt emotions, so nothing's changed there. So you feel positive, you show positive, and that should be good for the employee. We can also talk about emotional authenticity, or how authentic people feel, or how authentic they appear, with these different strategies. And so authenticity should be high for deep acting, right? Because you're changing your actual feelings to show the emotion. And so what you show should be fairly genuine, and you should feel kind of alignment kind of with your internal state with what you're showing to others. And that feels authentic. That's also the case for the expression of naturally felt emotions. So the authenticity should be high there, because clearly you already feel the positive emotions and you're simply letting that show in your interactions with customers. For surface acting, though, authenticity will be low, right? Because you're not changing anything about your internal state. You're keeping the negative emotions and only putting on a mask, you might say, or putting on a positive face without really feeling anything. And so there's a sense that there's a discrepancy between the true internal state that you have and the external appearance that you're presenting to others. So again, effort can be high or low for these different strategies. Felt emotions can be positive or negative for these strategies, and the level of authenticity can be high or low for these strategies. So then connecting these strategies to various outcomes, there's been a lot of work and enough to do at least two meta-analyses. I think there's actually been 3 or 4 to connect these things to various outcomes that organizations care about. I'm going to talk about 2 meta-analyses, the Holshager and Shu and the Mesmer-Magnus et al. And so I identify them by H&S and M&M in the coefficients that I'm going to report. So, and I'm also, I'm going to list like emotional exhaustion as a primary kind of outcome. And then the coefficients there are rows, they're population correlation coefficients from these meta-analyses. And so with emotional exhaustion, many of you may know that this is a primary component of burnout. It's thought to be the central component of burnout, where you feel emotionally depleted. And so with this, you see that surface acting has a positive population correlation, that row value of 0.439 or 0.38, depending on which meta-analysis you're looking at. And any of the blue coefficients are significant. So you see that it's a strong positive relationship between surface acting and emotional exhaustion. So you have, again, people are exerting a lot of effort and they also feel negatively. So those 2 things combined make people feel more emotionally exhausted. Deep acting, in contrast, has coefficients that in one case it's significant at 0.088, but in the other case it's not significant at 0.02. Across these 2, though, you can see that it's the very small effect for deep acting. And so, again, you have kind of conflicting mechanisms here that could potentially explain why it doesn't really relate to exhaustion at a high level. One is that you're exerting high effort, so that can be depleting, but you're also feeling better as a result of the deep acting. So you feel more positive emotions, and those 2 kind of counteracting kind of experiences kind of maybe cancel each other out to some extent. The expression of naturally felt emotions was only examined in the Mesmer-Magnus meta-analysis, and the coefficient there is 0.12. Wasn't significant. There weren't very many original studies that were included in this meta-analytic test. But the effect there is pretty small. You can talk about psychological strain as an outcome. This is only examined in the Holshager and Shu meta-analysis. Again, surface acting, strong positive relationship to strain. Deep acting, not significantly related to strain. And there was no meta-analytic test for naturally felt emotions. This set of findings is very consistent with emotional exhaustion, right? Job satisfaction, so the extent to which you like and enjoy your job. Surface acting has a fairly strong negative relationship to job satisfaction, so employees are less satisfied when they surface act more. Deep acting is unrelated to job satisfaction, so the coefficients there are not significant. And the expression of naturally felt emotions has a strong positive relationship with this. So being able to show positive emotions that you naturally feel has a fairly strong correlation with being satisfied on the job. So you might call all 3 of these outcomes indicators of worker well-being. And so you get the overall pattern that surface acting is harmful. Deep acting is sort of unrelated or has mixed findings with well-being. And naturally felt emotions has mixed to positive relationships with well-being outcomes. Turning then to what you might call kind of effectiveness or performance kind of outcomes. What you see in the meta-analytic tests is that surface acting is largely unrelated to performance outcomes. So both those coefficients are not significant across the two meta-analyses. But for deep acting, you get a positive relationship with what you might call emotional performance for employees. And so, again, you're with surface acting, you're exerting effort to only change the outward appearance, but it might not be a very effective kind of or convincing kind of emotional performance, right? So you're not getting kind of a positive benefit of this. Whereas in contrast with deep acting, you're changing what you feel, and what you show then is more authentic and more convincing. And there was no reporting of coefficients for naturally felt emotions. There were not enough studies to really kind of report this in the meta-analytic findings. Similarly, you can look at customer satisfaction ratings, and what you see is, again, surface acting is unrelated, and deep acting has a strong positive relationship here. So again, that changing internal experiences seems to be beneficial for effectiveness. Changing only outward appearances through surface acting doesn't benefit performance, doesn't seem to harm it, but it doesn't actually produce kind of a positive effect for evaluating how the employees are doing. So next, we can talk a little bit about the assessment of emotional labor. So what are some ways you can go about kind of measuring constructs in emotional labor? And what I'm going to do is talk about specific constructs and maybe